Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've got a few people on already. We will start our webinar in a couple of minutes. But yeah, just hold on, and if you are interested, you can go and have a look at our document in the meantime. We'll be there in a couple of minutes. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for our third Thursday Science webinar series, where we're showcasing the science behind the European Marine Board publications. My name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and I will be your moderator today. So welcome, everybody. And I am really looking forward to this webinar. Now, if I can just get my, there we go. Okay, so some housekeeping rules to start off with. Please make sure that your name is entered onto the Zoom screen so that we can see who you are when you're asking questions. Please use the Q&A for any questions that you might have for our speakers. And if you have any technical issues that you need support for, please use the chat function to any of the Marine Board participants on this webinar. Also, if you are going to ask a question, please let us know what organization and country you're from. It's always useful to know and have a name to put to the question. And I will then, when we get to the questions section, I will look at the questions and find the questions that I think is answerable and answer and speak and present them to the speakers. Also, for your knowledge, the webinar is actually being recorded and it will be made available both on our website and on the Marine Board YouTube channel. So you will be able to watch it again later. So for today, we will be focusing on the specific document on valuing marine ecosystems. It's our Future Science Brief number 5. Where we basically looked at taking into account the values of ecosystem benefits in the blue economy. So the link to the website is there, and I think Paula is also, somebody's already put it in the chat, so you'll be able to download the document there. So this document was launched at European Parliament in April of 2019. It's a document that was very long in the making, but actually has had quite a lot of uptake since then. It was also presented at the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly in May of 2019, and it has been referenced in the Commission document on the EU guidance on integrated ecosystems and their services into decision-making. And some of the recommendations from our document was actually included in the Commission's Blue Economy Report for 2020. So it's actually had quite a lot of uptake, which is great to hear. But here we are today to actually hear the science that sort of has gone into it. And we'll have two speakers today. The first one is Dr. Gill Ainsworth. She's a social scientist at the Department of Applied Economics of the University of Santiago de Compostela. And she is going to be talking about cultural values of marine ecosystem services in the United Kingdom. And the second speaker is going to be Gregg Verutes. Sorry, I might have mispronounced your last name. You might want to do that better when you introduce yourself. He is a PhD student in marine science, technology, and management at the Campus de Mar, also at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And he is going to be talking about introducing a valuing nature's contribution to people with a marine invest toolbox. So really looking forward to these two speakers. And for now, I think that's the only slides that I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if, Jill, if you can share your screen and start your presentation, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hello, yes, thank you, Sheila, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Okay. So my name is Gill Ainsworth, and I'm a social scientist working at the University of Santiago de Compostela. My main research areas are non-monetary values, originally working on birds and threatened species in Australia, and most recently on marine ecosystem services in the UK and now in Spain. So the research I'm going to tell you about is a 12-month social science project that looked at cultural values of marine ecosystem services in the UK. It was a collaboration between the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the Scottish Association for Marine Science. And this was part of the 5-year UK-wide multidisciplinary marine ecosystems research programme, which aimed to better understand marine ecosystem services in the UK to support decision-making. Our work package topic included a mix of interrelated ecological and social science studies with a strong focus on provisioning and tourism, leisure, recreation. The overall goal was to expose the big picture outcomes regarding a range of management measures spanning fisheries, aquaculture, conservation, and in particular looking at ecological properties and both monetary and non-monetary values. And this research centered around the consequences of 4 strongly contrasting societal scenarios, which were developed as part of the National Ecosystem Research Follow-on project. And each of these was accompanied by narratives around a range of marine management measures, which were partly co-developed with stakeholders. So we chose 2 case study regions in the UK, the west of Scotland and southwest England, because they're important providers of several kinds of different marine ecosystem services. And also they present various management challenges, especially through the existence of marine protected areas. And these areas were relatively understudied. So cultural values in this context relate to cultural ecosystem services. So these are the often intangible benefits that people receive from their interactions with the natural environment and that contribute to individual and collective human well-being. And they can be things like spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, reflection, recreation, and aesthetic experiences. This project aimed to advance our understanding of values relating to marine and coastal cultural ecosystem services and derive benefits, particularly in the context of marine management. And it aimed to address several knowledge gaps and research priorities, which had been identified in a recent literature review. And the first of these was a lack of integrated valuation approaches, which were addressed, this issue was addressed through the broader work package. But specifically within the Cultural Values Project, we integrated 2 valuation models for the purposes of interpreting our data, and I'll talk about those a bit later. There was also a lack of knowledge about the relationship between cultural ecosystem services and human well-being. So I'm going to present some results which help to explain this relationship. And the project also explored synergies and trade-offs between cultural ecosystem services and human-related activities in the context of the 4 NEEF scenarios. We used the community voice method, which was specifically designed to facilitate the engagement of diverse kinds of stakeholders in environmental decision-making processes in a non-confrontational way, especially those who don't normally have a say, like local residents. So the first stage of this method involves filming stakeholder interviews to gather views and deepen understanding of people's values. The second stage typically involves developing a set of management measures and criteria to evaluate those measures. And then thirdly, the resulting film from the interviews is usually presented in a multi-criteria analysis workshop, where decision makers can consider stakeholders' perspectives while deliberating on potential management measures. We purposefully selected interviewees through an elaborate stakeholder analysis conducted in Work Package 2 of the broader project. And this identified nearly 300 individuals through past projects, as well as conducting our own snowball sampling. And my colleague and I then conducted 40 filmed stakeholder interviews with representatives from the provisioning, regulatory, tourism, leisure recreation, and local community sectors. Our interviews focused on cultural values, so these were the important places, practices, experiences, capabilities, and identities that people said were provided by their local marine environment. We explored their perceptions about current and future management of the marine environment and how they thought 2 protected areas should be managed, including the North Devon Marine Pioneer and the Inner Hebrides and the Minches Candidate SAC. And finally, we asked their opinions about 4 NEAF policy scenarios. Those were the local stewardship, nature at work, world markets, and national security scenarios. So this diagram represents the first analytical framework we used, which was developed building on the work done in the NEAF research. And it shows the dynamic nature of how the biophysical and cultural domains shape and enable each other. So at the top here, we have the biophysical domain. And this, in this case, this is the marine environment. Cultural ecosystem services include the places that people visit and the activities that they're able to do there. Cultural goods are the products that are enabled because of the biophysical domain, including opportunities for recreation, locally provenanced food, etc. And the cultural ecosystem benefits at the bottom include human identities, well-being, experiences, and capabilities which are shaped and enabled by all of the above. So I've included some results from our interviews here to give you an idea of the overall themes and patterns. And the brackets show the number of interviewees who talked about a particular theme. So in terms of places, our interviewees mostly talked about visiting islands, coasts, and estuaries. The practices that they carried out were mostly producing and caring, so things like fishing and conservation, as well as playing and exercising, and so those are leisure activities. In terms of the benefits they said they received, almost all of our interviewees described a sense of belonging to their local marine area and a sense of place. Regarding well-being, the themes that were most important to them were cultural identity, action and participation in society, physical energy and livelihood security, physical and mental well-being, and good social relationships. And relating to experiences, you can see there's a mix here of psychological and emotional and intellectual stimulation that they get from the marine environment. And they also described how interacting with their local marine area facilitated various capabilities such as knowledge, skills, and personal advancement. The second valuation framework we used to pull out themes from our interviews was the IPBS conceptual framework. And in this way, we can better understand the highly complex interactions between the natural world and human societies. So here, good quality of life is linked directly to institutions, governance, and other indirect drivers. And these then influence all other parts of the system. So these results are from a question we asked about interviewees about their values regarding how they would like to see the management of the marine environment. And so in terms of good quality of life, many interviewees talked about the importance of good relationships, either between themselves or between themselves and other species. And they also thought that the marine environment ought to include protection of some habitats or species and ought to reflect the intrinsic value of nature. And we discovered from these themes that cultural benefits were bidirectional. So they contributed directly to a fulfilled human life, and they were associated with charismatic marine life and biodiversity. This table shows the information we provided to describe how the 4 NEEF scenarios would impact on several attributes, such as leisure and tourism, capture fisheries, species diversity and protection. So each scenario was designed to be extreme, to get people thinking about what was important to them. Nature at Work described a future that has the strongest emphasis on environmental protection, but also requires strong governance. Local stewardship emphasized devolution of governance to local institutions. World markets emphasized globalization, and national security was a protectionist approach that emphasized self-sufficiency. So we asked interviewees which scenario they liked most and which least, what impacts they liked and didn't like, and how the scenarios fitted with their vision for their local area. So overall, equal numbers of our interviewees preferred local stewardship and nature at work, and they equally disliked world markets and national security. The attributes they liked most related to scale of operation, so for example, local governance, having legitimacy and a say in decision-making processes, having appropriate systems of access and property rights allocated to different kinds of stakeholders, and appropriate rules, norms, legislation, and treaties that reflect their values. And so these quotes represent some of the shared values that our interviewees expressed. So this first one is from a regulatory stakeholder in the southwest of England, talking about local stewardship. And he says, with this scenario, we're going in the right direction through both legislation and through collaboration. It's also to do with the population feeling that they're involved. It's not just top-down management from government. Another regulatory stakeholder, this time from the west coast of Scotland, talking about nature of work, says there's a higher value placed on environmental awareness, sustainability, and there are more areas that are protected and industries managed in a stronger way. So I think that strategy fits closest to my vision for what I would like to see. So at the same time as we were doing this analysis, the managers of the economic and ecological projects in the work package were working with data that they had collected and were inputting findings into the 4 NEEF scenarios so that we would be able to compare the data. So this slide represents some of the outputs from the ecological and economic modelling simulations, which help us better understand how the consequences of the 4 scenarios differ on various marine ecosystem services. So for example, the yellow, red and green petals relate to the ecological data that was input, and the blue and orange relate to the economic data. And the longer the petal in the rows, the stronger the influence. So if you'd like to find out more about this aspect of the research, that's available in the MERP final report that you can find through that link. So the final step was to hold a multi-criteria analysis workshop in Scotland for Scottish stakeholders from the government, fisheries, ENGO, and tourism recreation sectors. So we presented the 40-minute film that we created, which represented shared values, competing interests, and opinions about the 4 NEEF scenarios. We also presented economic and ecological modelling simulations and to explain the consequences of the 4 NEEF scenarios on ecosystem services. And then we asked stakeholders to tell us about their preferred management measures. And we discussed fisheries regulation, gear restrictions, technical measures, and salmon aquaculture. So one of the key findings from this workshop was that the role of MPAs as a means to protect key features, as opposed to no-take zones, for example, as a form of set-aside or rewilding, was extremely contentious. And it was one of the main points of conflict between the differing objectives of conservation and fisheries management. And there's a link to the findings of this research if you'd like to find out more. So to sum up then, findings from research on cultural values can have significant impact. This study provided us with insights into stakeholders' views about the importance of various marine activities. It can also contribute to marine spatial planning by providing perspectives on marine management in general and for marine protected areas in particular. And it can contribute to marine ecosystem management and policy by helping us to understand about marine users' shared values, where there might be competing interests, and also the potential trade-offs they may be prepared to make regarding management of marine ecosystem services and their own activities. And so finally, the major outputs from this project include two films. First of all, we created an 8-minute trailer so that we could showcase the research to stakeholders and to other researchers, and also the 40-minute documentary that we created and which we used to guide management of the marine environment in the multi-criteria analysis workshop. And we also produced 3 publications. So the first of these is about incorporating cultural values into values-led management strategies. And it includes a thematic code book of marine cultural ecosystem benefits as supplementary material that we developed based on the 2 conceptual frameworks we used to identify and interpret our data. The second is a report about stakeholder perceptions regarding marine management in the southwest of England. And the third is a paper about operationalizing intrinsic values to enable the interests and perspectives of non-human stakeholders to be directly expressed alongside those of humans. And so finally, I'd like to thank all of the organizations involved in the research and to you for your attention today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. That was great. I see we have one quick question for clarification in the question and answers. So I'm going to take that one because I think it will round off your discussion quite well. It's from Fergal McGrath. He asks how far inland was considered as a catchment for stakeholder interviews in these areas, and were the stakeholders interviewed all living or working in the coastal strip or town?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we specifically identified stakeholders who were living and working in coastal areas, and so they had that direct connection with the marine environment, and that was one of our criteria for selecting interviewees. So it was really important because we needed to talk to people who had experience and would be able to answer the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any other questions for clarification. We will have a longer discussion, and you are more than welcome to keep on putting your questions into the question and answer for Jill. And then after Greg has spoken, we can come back to them and we can have a longer discussion then. So if you want to still think of some questions while Greg gets underway, that is also fine. So thank you very much, Jill, and we will catch up after Greg's talk. Thank you. Okay, and our next speaker, as I said, is Greg. And Greg, you're going to have to do your own last name.
Gregg Verutes.
Say that again.
Verutes.
Oh, okay. And if you can start sharing your screen and giving your talk, that'd be great. And Jill and I can probably mute ourselves and put our video off, and that'd be great.
Are you able to see?
Yes, indeed. You might want to just put it in full screen mode because there we go, perfect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gregg Verutes. I'm a colleague of Jill's at Santiago de Compostela, and I want to talk today more broadly about coastal and marine ecosystem services and a toolkit that I helped develop with Stanford University and the Natural Capital Project starting about 10 years ago. So real broadly, ecosystem services are central to multiple global agreements. We know the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, number 14, Life Below Water, also the CBD. And as of yesterday in the US, given the current new administration, we are happy to be re-engaged with the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. So with that backdrop, I want to speak about answering this question. In particular, why do we value coastal wetlands? How does it work? What does it entail? And what can it do? But before I speak to that, I want to emphasize that the uptake of natural capital approaches, similar to what Jill had discussed earlier, started within the NGO community and the public sector. And gradually, we're now seeing this reach companies with increasing uptake, even starting to see it integrate into business. And this is important because some of these corporations have huge supply chains. And so even just a small impact or change in the positive direction can lead to large gains in terms of conservation and management objectives. I don't think this slide is necessary for this group, but just to re-emphasize or reiterate the distinction between natural capital, which is the supply or stock of natural assets, air, water, land, biodiversity, minerals, soil. These assets, people can derive benefits, and we call those benefits ecosystem services. So the main distinction is the stock, natural capital, think about it like a bank account for nature, and then those flows of benefits are what we call services or ecosystem services. And ecosystem services, as you heard from Jill, can be many and varied. Forested areas along streams hold soil in place and improve water quality for people downstream. When we look at coastal and marine services, habitats in rivers and along coastlines support populations of fish that provide food, including in areas of chronic food insecurity. Mangroves stabilize shorelines and decrease damages to people and property. And our forests and oceans store carbon that helps regulate climate. Moving from that introduction, I'm going to walk through this framework that we've abstracted from our experience carrying out these targeted ecosystem services assessments that we believe can help foster high quality results and drive action. And so the figure you're seeing here shows an idealized process, again, based on our experience applying this ESA approach. And we've done it in about 20 different contexts around the globe. I think key to this whole framework is the idea of iteration, revisiting steps in the process as you get new and better insight and information over time. And this can happen within a particular step or between steps. And we've found in particular that after synthesizing some results from an analytical model or process, it doesn't have to be models, it can be discussions like Jill highlighted in some of her work, but ultimately returning to some of these previous steps is quite important. And I'll walk through each step one by one as I walk through a case study, but in simply put, scoping is really identifying the problems and the research questions. Data is about compiling what information is available. Scenarios help us develop these storylines or narratives that describe how actions taken today can play out into the future. And then we use, oftentimes we use analytical models like the one that I'm going to highlight today called INVEST to help us assess those outcomes of those scenarios. Finally, some of those results can be in a rather raw, unpolished format, and so synthesis allows us to process those results of the analysis. It also serves as this key reflection point where we can go back and discuss with stakeholders, are the actual scenarios we've evaluated feasible or even plausible? And then we can meet with stakeholders and adjust course. Finally, communication or reaching out helps bringing what we've done to that core audience and distill the analyses into clear stories. Another diagram within that INVEST bubble, that analytical step, step 5, is this idea of supply, service, and value. This is really the grounding framework for quantifying and valuing ecosystem services. In other words, changes in ecosystem structure, the natural capital, whether they're natural or human caused, lead to changes in the outputs of services, which changes people's relationship to those services and how they value them. And we heard from Jill quite a bit about the social and sort of non-monetary values that people derive from these benefits. Within the INVEST toolkit, it's an open source toolkit available online. I can provide the link shortly. There are a number of different coastal and marine modules. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 as I walk through a case study: fisheries, coastal protection, and coastal blue carbon. One of the interesting features about INVEST is that it uses ecological production functions. Some of you may be familiar in terms of valuation with value or benefit transfer approaches, where you take values from elsewhere, especially if there is limited data, and transfer those values, for an acre of or a hectare of mangroves this value can be transferred because it's close enough or a similar ecosystem. With Invest, we try to move beyond that and use this ecological production function, which specifies the feasible output of ecosystem services that are provided or produced by an ecosystem. In this case, I'm showing typical services produced in the Northwest USA, in the Pacific Northwest. An ecological production function is the ecological processes that determine the feasible outputs of the services. And so changes in those conditions from natural disturbance or human modification will alter those production functions and shift the amounts of various services that people can receive or are provided. Finally, before I walk through the case studies, I just want to emphasize that at the Natural Capital Project, my previous employer, we use this approach in numerous decision contexts around the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable development planning and resilient coastal communities, but there are other contexts where these models have been applied. And knowing my audience here, there are a few more dots on the map for Europe, but there's always more gaps to be filled. And my seat at a university in Spain now has helped open up some of these opportunities in Europe as well. So I think it's best to learn sort of what, get a look under the hood at a scientific model when you walk through a case study. And this is a case study from focusing on resilient coastal communities and sustainable development planning in the Gulf of Mexico, in between the US and Mexico, in particular, the coastal wetlands of Galveston Bay, Texas. Back in 2008, Hurricane Ike was one of the costliest hurricanes in history. It made landfall around Galveston, Texas, and killed more than 100 people. Undeveloped areas of Texas coastline were observed to protect inland communities from the massive storm. People who live near these natural areas suffered less damage because the land served as a natural sponge, absorbing the floodwater. And so what I want to talk to you today is about how that storm, as well as recent ones, in 2016, we had Hurricane Harvey as well, how those storms present a problem not just to people and property, but also opportunities for bird and wildlife viewing, some of the cultural heritage. There are numerous Civil War sites, fishing, catch and revenue, and also beaches for visitation and tourism. So walking through that, that 6-step approach that I mentioned, just real quickly, I want to highlight this first step of scoping. This is probably pretty obvious to most of you, and I'm sure many of you do this as you undertake ecosystem service assessment or similar sorts of analyses. So it's nothing new, but I think the two pieces that are probably most important to highlight are that it's really important to prioritize from a long list of services. So we talked to people on the ground here and asked them what they value, what they prioritize, and it was a long list. And so doing an assessment like this, when you have 5, 10, 15 services, can be overwhelming. It's not to say that we're ignoring some of those benefits, but it's to say we've decided to focus on existing data that can help us focus in on a smaller subset of 3 to 5 benefits. Also, we need to define the scale, the spatial scale, the resolution of our outputs. Is that meaningful? Is that enough detail? And the time horizon at which we evaluated some of these scenarios, which involve sea level rise, which can play out over a longer period of time than something of a human intervention like building a seawall. So once we talk to stakeholders, they prioritize these 3 in particular: coastal protection, fisheries, and blue carbon. Next step is to do an assessment or an inventory of what information exists. And this is not an exhaustive list, but in terms of some of the services we looked at, things like coastal land use and land cover, bathymetry is really important because the ocean depth and the seafloor slope influences how a wave propagates, and storm surge and some of these other factors at play when we look at natural protection provided by habitats. Obviously, the distribution and quality of habitats are a really important input because those are the stock, the natural assets that we are trying to assess its value, both currently and potentially into the future in regards to ecosystem services. Storm duration and frequency is important because we want to be very clear to the people we're communicating this information to. What is the time horizon? Is it a 100-year storm, a 50-year storm that we're we're analyzing. And then also key fisheries, what information was available and what are the most commercially valuable fisheries in the area. Scenarios is a really important step. Again, this could be a whole conversation in itself, a whole webinar, but simply put, we looked at two different habitat management scenarios. This is the idea that with certain human interventions or the built environment, levees and seawalls, do we allow the marshes to migrate, or can they not keep up with sea level rise? And this is important because we're looking at this combination of green versus gray infrastructure. Do we restore the marshes and allow them to keep pace with sea level rise, or do we say the marsh is going to become overwhelmed and we need some sort of gray solution to help protect people and property in this case? And so the first step was really to look at how marshes might migrate under these different scenarios. And this is from the Sea Level Rise Effect Marsh Model, or SLAM, showing the distribution of coastal salt marshes as sea levels were to rise, taking into account ocean depth and elevation along the coastline. With that information in place, we can start to evaluate these different scenarios. And so the analysis step, or analyze, is really important to look at how scenarios define changes in ecosystems. Then we use, in this case, invest to map, measure, and value those changes to ecosystem services. And I'll walk you through the three services we looked at in a little bit more detail. First, with coastal protection. On the top, you can see that understanding the wave characteristics of a typical storm is really important in terms of wave height, storm surge level, and so forth. And at the bottom, we have our natural capital, these important habitats that essentially serve as natural breakwaters and break down a wave as it arrives on the shoreline. What you're seeing here on the top is that the characteristics of the storm, the current land cover, the impacts and costs all play into the equation we use to value coastal protection. And simply put, it's an avoided damages approach. So I can go into more detail if there are questions, but essentially what we're doing is we're estimating the property values that would be impacted by waves and where wave attenuation from habitat occurs. And then we use this information to calculate the values added by the functioning ecosystem. The next step, once we have some of those analytical results, is to do synthesis. It sounds obvious, and it is, but it's also really important because with INVEST in particular, the outputs are in this raw, sort of unpolished format. And so we need to take those outputs and visualize them in a way that can communicate the findings for decision makers, policymakers, et cetera. And what you're seeing here is some of the maps from those three services in coastal Belize. And it helps us frame the different scenarios that we evaluated. In this case, a future vision for the coastal management of Belize's human activities and habitats. So let's look into a little bit more detail in terms of wetland values, or the services provided by coastal wetlands. With coastal protection in Galveston, Texas, we found that, as you might expect, damages will increase with rising sea levels. As sea level rises, combined with storm surge, more frequent and intense storms, we can expect more damages. That's the obvious one. But we're also able to look at different subregions and also in space, how wetlands on average can reduce damages by 5%. And in certain cases, as I'll talk about in a moment, that 5% was not enough to make the case for investment in natural systems. In the case of one of the chemical plants there just wasn't enough salt marsh to restore. And so other strategies or interventions had to be pursued because the natural system was not able to keep up with sea level rise. In terms of blue carbon, again, I won't have time to go into the model itself and sort of how we analyze or evaluate blue carbon. But what we're showing here is both a near-term look at carbon storage and sequestration versus emissions and a longer-term view. And what we found was sort of 2015 is the breaking point where Galveston Bay goes from an area that actually stores and sequesters more carbon than it emits to a net emitter. And so what that means is if we allow the marshes to migrate and we don't block them from keeping up with sea level rise, by 2050, we can expect there to be a positive or a storage or sequestration of carbon. However, by 2050, regardless of the management scenario, Galveston Bay becomes a net emitter. And that's important information for policymakers to think about and managers to think about how much time we have left and what kind of strategies we can pursue over the long term. Finally, fisheries, again, could be a talk within itself, but what we try to do is just really look at this relationship between increasing marsh habitat and how much we can expect in terms of increase in catch. And you can see the curves are different for the 3 different prioritized species. And that's important information to understand just in terms of what kind of return on investment you can expect, restoring the marsh habitat and increase in catch and revenue for that particular species. So in summary, I want to just highlight one more thing before I summarize, is that the spatially explicit, the GIS piece of some of this modeling is important because it can give us insights that vary in space. And so we looked at coastal protection value for 3 different areas and found that certain areas were worth that investment in terms of coastal protection and restoring the marsh. Whereas unfortunately, we found out that the existing marsh around, in this case, the Dow chemical plant, was not enough to keep up with sea level rise. And so other strategies like seawalls and levees would need to be pursued to provide that protection that was needed moving forward. Okay, so my final slide, just want to summarize and reiterate that INVEST allows for the estimation of ecosystem services. And as I mentioned, they're many and varied. In particular, we focused on coastal and marine ecosystems for this case study and demonstration. And these services identified are really important for international conventions and agreements. And they also allow conservation groups to engage with industry around shared benefits and values. So with that, I would say thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of our research and open it up to discussion for question and answer.
Thank you very much, Jill. Sorry, Greg. I'm reading Jill and I'm just speaking it. So I see there's a question, but maybe it's actually more for discussion in the chat. So I will ask a question quickly. I don't know if there's anybody else who has a specific question on Greg's presentation. If not, you can, I think, have you stopped sharing your screen, Greg? If you have, that's great. There's a question from one of my colleagues, which we have to put in the chat because we can't put it in the question and answer, is did the stakeholders know about the carbon sequestration role of the wetland before the activity? Was it sort of local common knowledge? Or, you know, did they understand that after the activity? So, and on top of that, are the ecosystem services of the marsh, or were they provided? So the question is, did they know that there was a carbon sequestration role for the wetland, or was that new knowledge that they gained through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on that's a great question. The stakeholder group that you're talking about. So if we were engaging with scientists who this is their, our managers, where this is kind of the work that they do, I'm pretty sure that most of them were aware of that. But certainly Texas is a red state, so there's a lot of climate change denial there. And so a lot of times you have to use these benefits, these objectives to help frame sort of different synergies, right? So we would try to find common ground with them on other benefits and then speak to the synergistic effect that you get from an investment like restoring the salt marsh. So maybe they were birders. And so while they denied climate change and the fact that sea levels were rising, more intense storms, even though this area is literally called Hurricane Alley and there are storms coming through on a regular basis, we tried to engage them on things like birding to say, you know, you're probably noticing that the birds that you used to see when you grew up in Texas are disappearing, and that's because their ranges are shifting. Also trying to speak to things that are more top of mind, like the fact that their property might be flooding, and say, look, if we restore the marsh, we're not just getting this benefit, but we're also helping regulate climate. We're protecting habitats for wildlife and things like that. So certainly some of them were either in denial or just didn't understand the value, like coastal blue carbon, because it's not something that you see like damages from storms, these more intrinsic values, but trying to pull them all together and say, look, these are important for a number of reasons, and we can find examples where they can all go up if we invest here. And so that kind of helped make the case. And if they weren't aware initially, we tried to make them aware through this process.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I have two more questions for you. The first one is, I think is for you. Pedro Carrasco also asked some questions for Gill, but let's take these quickly. He asks, were there other important coastal ecosystem services that the researchers thought were relevant, based on knowledge or literature, but were not considered relevant by the stakeholders?
Yes, is this one for me? I think it could go either way.
Yes,
maybe
I think so. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think if you can answer it, and maybe Gill can also answer the same question if she thinks it's relevant.
So the project was a while ago, and so I'm forgetting the exact history, but I think in this example, and also one that I briefly touched on in coastal Belize, it was hard for some stakeholders to let go of things that were more important. And so I think what we tried to do was make the emphasis of the modeling, the data collection on those key services, but certainly through the literature and other input, there were other more local, more hard to capture, non-monetary, like what Gill had shown. An example would be from Belize. We did the same services, coastal protection, fisheries, and recreation and tourism. But there was cultural heritage and this Garifuna indigenous population that had some other things as well. And so one of the ways that we got at that in a larger example was organizing these advisory committees where we could have specific objectives for a region that could kind of percolate up and be reprioritized over other ones. And so one example of that was in coastal Belize, southern Belize, they prioritized fisheries more because there was more habitat, there was just traditionally more catch. The people down there in terms of subsistence needed those fisheries more, whereas in the north, there was already extensive infrastructure for recreation and tourism. And so that was prioritized in the northern region by this committee that we organized up there. So I think some of these sub-objectives and things that weren't initially prioritized can reemerge as you start to get more explicit in terms of a regional focus. And that didn't happen so much in the Galveston example I showed today because it was a very small area. But when we worked in national areas like Belize, that could be kind of brought out a little bit better.
Thanks. And Gill, do you want to answer the same question? So were there any other more important coastal services that you thought was more important, but the stakeholders didn't really take that up? We can't hear you, by the way.
Thank you. I think this relates to who we interviewed, and we had a strong representation from, for example, coastal managers and fishers and tourism, leisure, recreation. I think if we'd had more representatives from the business community, perhaps, and if we'd been able to interview more local residents, then yes, there could well have been a broader range of ecosystem services that were identified. Most of our interviewees, if we think about the kinds of activities that they were doing, most of them talked about provisioning and leisure. And there were two other categories according to our analytical frameworks, which we could have captured data in, which related more to harvesting foods and also items for example, artworks, collecting things from the beach, pieces of wood shells, etc. But a whole variety of other things which didn't really come out of our research and which potentially could if we had broadened our sample, and that was really it was a matter of logistics that influenced who we could interview for this first part of the project. So
Yeah.
yes, I think just to follow on from that, of what I would have loved to have done is to have conducted a quantitative analysis and had a much broader sample as well. I think that would be a really interesting way to see just which are the ecosystem services that are relevant on a much more broad level according to the, demographics in the society.
Thank you very much. And while we've got you there, there's another question from Pedro, and he asked, could you explain the reasons why people disliked the global market scenario, and what that means for the mostly globalized economy?
Well, given the information that we provided for the 4 scenarios, the global market scenario very strongly emphasized a lack of local decision making, and tried to reflect as much as possible how the globalized system works. And for our stakeholders, they were really interested in being able to have a say, whereas that scenario negated their ability to contribute and basically kept them out of the decision-making process. So I think that was one of the main factors. But also it was very detrimental to the ecosystem services that were provided. So, for example, the attributes that were affected were things like water quality, impacts on species diversity, leisure and recreation. So there would be environmental impacts, which our participants viewed negatively because they were very interested in preserving their local environment and being able to work with that to develop local produce at a community scale, and they wanted to have those sort of strong community networks. So how that relates to the global economy, I think again it goes back to who we interviewed. In this research, we attempted to interview a representative from the business community, and he reacted quite adversely to the scenarios. He didn't like the method at all, and so withdrew from the research. So that was one of the logistical challenges that we faced. How do we do this sort of research in a realistic and pragmatic way with members of the business community? Because I think that their perspectives on the globalization and the global market scenario may be quite different to those of the people who we interviewed.
Thank you very much. And then there's one more question for you, and then I think there's a couple for Greg, but let's go with this one as well. So this one is from Philippe Martineau, and he asks, what was the main point of discussion around MPAs versus no-take zones that the stakeholders had?
Yes, going from memory, so with the no-take zones, from our interviews, our interviewees were saying that no-take zones would be really useful, for example, because they're quite mobile. So you could have a small no-take zone, which would be open and accessible to fishing, for example, for a short period of time. And then that could be, that no-take zone could move to another area, and there'll be a lot of flexibility in that system, whereas with MPAs there tend to be a more static geographic scale and area, which is fixed in space and time. And also because of the migration of fish stocks, for example, or marine predators, which have very large geographic ranges, there's different implications in terms of how these two systems work. And so that was where the conservation and fisheries perspectives really conflicted. And I guess it showcases why it's so important to have different kinds of stakeholders involved in these discussions and these decision-making processes, so that all of these views can be expressed, and as a way to find out what the shared values are, because people do, and that's a really good way to work through conflict, is identifying where people can agree, and then using that as a basis to try to move the discussion forward in terms of addressing where conflict lies.
Thanks, Jill. Okay, then I have a question for Greg by Leonard van der Poel. I see you want to answer the question, so great. So the question is, when defining the scope of an ecosystem services assessment, how do you translate the services most valued by stakeholders to the list of the most important services? And is there a systematic way to do this?
Yeah, great question. So I'm sure there are systematic ways to do this. And while we didn't necessarily use one that we can show and share with you, it was definitely planned out. So in terms of sort of mocking up what that would look like, who we were going to talk to, how we were going to make sure that we thoroughly kind of assessed what the different stakeholder values were in the area. And this is really anywhere. But we do have, I want to use this opportunity to share that we do have a marine planning short course that's online. It's just a series of videos and exercises. And one of the exercises, I'll paste it into the chat, is this idea of identifying stakeholders and sort of a checklist of the questions you might want to ask to elicit this kind of information. And so through that, I think we can answer that question of what are the most important services. So this exercise identifies the stakeholders and the kinds of questions you would ask, but then the next logical step would be to ask them to help you prioritize among the most important services. And so I just pasted that link into the chat, and then also use the opportunity to share the other link, which is the main course itself, if folks are interested in checking that out. It tracks a different case study, some of the work in coastal Belize, but the short course is freely available and not limited in time windows. It's asynchronous learning, which we're all familiar with these days. And so you can do it at your own pace. There's also optional technical exercises if you're a GIS sort of analytical mind. But if you just want to watch it and absorb some of the material, it tracks a case study much like I showed you today for Texas. In this case, it's coastal and marine services in Belize.
Thanks. Okay, and then we have two questions, and I'm going to ask both, and then because we're running out of time, you can answer both, I think. The first one is by Alessandra Nevaret, and he or she asked, I think it's a she, has any public policies been put in place after either of your studies? And then the second question by Hannah Jones, which I find quite interesting, is that marine cultural services have, and their importance have sort of taken a back seat given the pandemic. And do you think that'll change?
Yeah,
so
I'll kick
actually
it
the
off.
question is, the question
Jill
is they've taken a back seat in terms of research and their ability to quantify it. And do you think it will change because of the pandemic? So you go, Greg.
Yeah, I'll speak to the first one. I think Jill has been doing some research on the second, so I'll push that to her. But in terms of Alejandra's question, I think I haven't tracked the project too closely, but some of the more valuable outputs of this work is just generally awareness and connections between stakeholders, researchers, people working there, and really a launching point for more detailed studies. So through our work, we felt like we identified and kind of collated existing data. And so that allowed others to kind of launch from there to do more detailed work on fisheries or some of the other services we looked at, because this was a sort of a rapid assessment, a quick first step. And so we certainly didn't answer all the questions or in the level of detail that you could want. In terms of actual public policy, I believe it led to a modification of this nature reserve in the area, or it's kind of like a marine protected area that would help better capture or protect some of the biodiversity and ecosystem services that we found in the area. So it helped kind of redelineate that protected area and the way that they manage that nature reserve. If you look at the short course that I shared the link for, in Belize, it actually led to legislation, a coastal zone management plan that was developed and endorsed by their government. And so that's an example of a more concrete public policy outcome from some of this work. So it just depends. And I think, yes, a piece of paper and a plan is nice, but sometimes the social connections and awareness that comes out of this work, or just being able to identify data for subsequent work, is even more valuable, in my opinion, than a legislation or a redelineation of a protected area.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, and Gill, if you want to have a go at the second question, that'd be great.
Yes, sure. It is obviously the pandemic is a really salient issue, and I'm aware of a number of different studies which are looking at the relationship between people's well-being and access to the marine environment, and my colleagues and I, and how that's been affected by restrictions on movement, population movement, because of the pandemic. And my colleagues and I at USC are working on a study at the moment which is looking specifically at that. So what are the well-being implications for people when their access is restricted to the marine environment, and even at the level of being able to have a view of the sea compared with having a view of a city environment, for example, and what are these relationships here? So I'm not sure that this kind of research has taken a back seat. In fact, I think there's quite a lot going on. It's probably just that the results aren't being published yet because the research is happening now. And my feeling is that there is enormous potential for all kinds of studies to be conducted in this area in relation to the pandemic. So yeah, I watch this space, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gill. And thank you very much, Greg. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I'm going to have to say thank you both for a great webinar. And I think somebody asked about whether this information will be made available. Yes, it is, in fact, on our YouTube channel. So you will be able to see it there. And I will just take this moment to say, again, thank you to our speakers, but also thank you to all of you that were there listening. And to remind you that we will have another webinar next, the third Thursday of February, which is the 18th of February. And it will be on ecosystem modeling. So the title is Disclosing the Truth, Are Models Better Than Observations? I think that's going to be quite controversial. So please join us then. But in the meantime, yes, thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. And if you want to see the talks or the slides, then do look at our website, which you can see there. And the YouTube channel will have these talks again. So thank you again to